Hello. So in this video, we are going to get our ogre to bounce back and forth off of those barriers. So we had set up these just kind of invisible barriers here, and then we got the ogre to move. So now we want to make the ogre bounce off of those. So the first part of getting the bouncing to work is to identify the collision between the ogre and those barriers. So I'm going to add a new onCollide function. So I think this is a good spot for it. Now I don't have a variable for the ogre, so I can't say ogre.onCollide, but I can just call onCollide. And then there's a different version of it that lets me give it two tags. So I will say onCollide quotes ogre, comma, quotes, and then barrier. So those are the two tags that I have. And now I'm actually remembering that that isn't even a tag that I can work with. So instead of the ogre tag, we actually should be using the enemy tag because that's the only one that has. I think I probably will end up changing this and adding it so there's two tags, but this is correct for now at least. Yeah, so I can get a collision event between enemies and barriers. And then comma, that third parameter now is the arrow function. Eventually I'm going to want the enemy to move and things like that. So I'm going to need some variables. I'm going to need to say e.move or something. Um, so I'm going to collect these two parameters. If I'm getting an enemy and a barrier, well, I'd like to have variables for those. So I'll say e comma b. That way e is now an actual variable that I can use to say things like dot move and dot flip and all that. Now notice how I put it down here. We got the enemy to update. So we got the enemy to update. So this is feeling pretty familiar. But what I'm going to do is put this close there. I'm going to control X. That way I just end up with having on update enemy close to on collide enemy and barrier. It doesn't really matter that they're next to each other. I just felt like this looked nicer, a little bit easier as you're looking through the code. But the important thing is that I want the on collide to be next to on update, not inside of it. Even though I already have an enemy and an E, it feels like the right place to be. I don't want to do this inside of there because on update is happening 60 frames per second. All right, so now I got on collide. I have an E variable here. So basically when I collide, I just want it to move the opposite direction. But I'm telling it to move positive 200 every time. So instead of hard coding this number, that should be a variable. So it could be a variable, but eventually I'm going to have a whole bunch of enemies and ogres. So let's do with the ogres kind of what we did with the player of having a speed property. So I'm going to go where I define the ogre, and I'm going to give it some custom properties. So comma, notice this is inside of those square brackets. Curly braces lets me type some custom JSON data. So I'm going to have a quote, and I'm going to call this xvel. That stands for x velocity. That's going to tell me whether my player is moving to the right or moving to the left. And then colon and 200. That was the number that I had before. All right, just a second, sorry. Okay, so now that I have a xvel property, which stands for the x velocity, so I know whether I'm going to the right or going to the left, that belongs to each one of those ogres. That's what doing it this way allows me to do. So if I have 10 different enemies, then they can all have their own individual x velocity property. So then I can use that down here. But getting back to that idea of not hard coding a positive 2 number, 200 on e move, I'm going to say e dot x vel. So move with whatever the velocity that it has. So that will at least get me back to where I was before. But now when I collide with a barrier, then I want to take e dot x vel and set it equal to just negative e dot x vel. I am taking that variable and setting it equal to negative of whatever it used to be. So now it's going to be negative when it hits that barrier. All right, so I got it to bounce back and forth then. So now that it's bouncing back and forth, I would like it to turn around so I can use that flip x property that we did for the player. So I can also say e dot flip x. Now that's a function and it takes in a Boolean, so I have to tell it true or false, should it be flipped or not. So at one point I need to tell it true. So I can at least get it to flip around, but then when it hits the left wall again, I want it to flip back. So sometimes I need it to say true, and sometimes I need it to say false. So that's exactly what an if statement's for. So say if greater than 2, I'm not really sure yet. I'm going to put this inside of here. So for some reason, under some condition, I'm supposed to flip x true, else, curly braces, e dot flip x parens false. So now what variables tell me whether I should be flipping or not? So I could just have I could make a new variable, or xvel essentially tells me this. So if it's the case that e dot xvel is negative, is less than 0, should be a less than sign. So if e dot xvel is less than 0, which means it's negative, well, I'm trying to go to the left, so I should flip my x position. I should be facing to the left. Otherwise, flip x should be false. So by using an if and an else setup here, it will handle both of those. Yep, so now it just turns back and forth like that. Yep. Now it's moving really, really fast, so I think I do want to slow it down. So for that ogre, set its x velocity, something more like 50. I mean, it's an ogre. It should probably go kind of slowly. Yeah, that looks about right. Yep. And possibly even slower than that. Yep, that seems about right. So now that we got the ogre marching back and forth, then I want to actually make these barriers disappear. Now they're not in my player's way, but I still see them and stand in that place and everything's okay. It's like I can even hide there almost. So let's just make the barriers disappear then to where they have an opacity of 0. So they're still there. We just don't see them. They're completely transparent. And I wonder if I move this, exactly what's going to happen. Because right now I have the barrier being not directly under the platform. So I think it looks okay, but I wonder if I do place it directly under the platform, if things are going to function properly. Because I'm wondering about the hitbox of the ogre. It still seems to work pretty well. It's a little bit bigger than what I expect, but Mm-hmm. Yeah, that looks good. And then I wonder if I happen to add another ogre in here, things work the way that I want them to work. Yeah, so they can both march back and forth like that. And that's all because I was using this exfil property, which is given to each ogre as it's created. So that way they can be handled differently.